Um, so we're going to finish discussing parties today. We're going to talk about how parties have changed over time, third parties, and of course, problems that we have with the current political party system. Right now, the Senate is hearing testimony from nominated Judge Barrett about her appointment to the Supreme Court. We've got Republicans on the one hand saying she's a phenomenal nominee, and Democrats on the other worrying about her stance on issues like abortion and same-sex marriage. Okay, so we talked last time about a little bit about party affiliation and kind of some of the activities that we see political parties doing. Today, we're not seeing as much of an alignment with the two-party system. We're in what's called a de-alignment. People are moving away from identifying with the party. Part of that's because of social diversity, and part of it is because we aren't relying on the parties to tell us who to vote for. We have social media. We have news at our fingertips. We don't have to have the parties tell us how to vote. We can figure it out for ourselves. So we don't need the parties to tell us how we should vote. And we are seeing more of a push for election reform. Third-party candidates, people outside of government to have the chance to share their thoughts. We're seeing people moving away from the two-party system and more towards voting based on who they think is the best candidate, regardless of party. And nowadays, about 40% of Americans identify as independent. In Arizona, 47% of voters are independents. That can have an impact on the upcoming Senate election. The Democratic candidate, Mark Kelly, actually has a chance to possibly win a Senate seat in Arizona for the first time in quite a while. And in Colorado, it's 34% of voters who are independents. So we are seeing people moving away from identifying as Democrat or Republican and more whoever's the best candidate for the job. For people who vote on a regular basis, they do tend to identify with a party simply because they have such strong feelings about issues like healthcare, abortion, military spending. So active voters will still identify with a party. People who don't vote as often may identify as an independent instead. Independents can make or break an election. If you look at 2016, independents didn't like either candidate, so they stayed home on election day. If they don't like Biden or Trump this time around, it could be a very peculiar election. They're not motivated by party, so if they don't like the candidates, they're not going to show up to vote. So whether or not they participate this election, that's still up in the air. Possibly, but it's going to depend on how they're feeling. All right, so we we've always pretty much had a two-party system, but it's always been a bit of a mixed bag as to what type of party we were looking at. The first two parties were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists wanted a strong government. They were the ones pushing for the new Constitution, pushing for the three branches of government. So they represented the New England merchants, largely the North. They wanted a national bank and to forgive the war debts from the Revolutionary War. The Anti-Federalists represented the South as agricultural interests and were more focused on issues of free trade. So our first two-party system was essentially, what type of government are we going to have? Is it going to be strong or weak? Will we have an executive or not? Of course, the Federalists ended up winning that argument with the creation of the Constitution. The next two-party system was the Democrats and the Whigs. But we can't really think of the Whigs as a strong political party. The only thing they really had in common was that they didn't like the Democrats. So you can't really have a coherent party if the only thing you have in common is you don't like the other guys. And so they would focus on their candidates' personal qualities rather than the issues. That's not sustainable past one or two elections. You might win one election, but the next election things are going to fall apart. They weren't a very viable party in that sense. And then we had Republicans and Democrats, keeping in mind that when we're talking about these two parties in the 1800s, they look very different from today. Democrats were the party of segregation, the party of white-only primaries. Republicans were the party of minorities, of pushing for minority rights. So Democrats were strong in the South, and Republicans were strong in the North. Texas used to be a solidly Democratic state. Illinois used to be a solidly Republican state. Obviously, that's not the case anymore. And there will be times where one party is just weaker than the other. During the New Deal and President FDR, Republicans couldn't come up with a better program than the New Deal. And they saw how popular it was. And so rather than continue to fight against it, they got on board with it. They said, okay, we can't fight it, we might as well join forces. If you can't beat them, join them. So Republicans ended up being pretty supportive of New Deal programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority bringing in electricity, Public Works Administration, and so on. Sometimes the strength of one party can lead the other one to stop fighting and join forces with them. If you wanted to win as a Republican in the 1930s and 1940s, you kind of had to be on the side of FDR. You had to be in support of Social Security, New Deal programs, holding the banks accountable, and so on. Okay, so our contemporary party system is the result of quite a lot of changes from the 1950s onward. We started to see Republicans winning seats in the South for a couple of reasons. First of all, taxes. Taxes used to be very, very high. If you were within the 1% of the wealthiest, you're paying 70–80% of your income in taxes. When Barry Goldwater ran for president in 1964, he ran on the argument that we had to reduce taxes, decrease government regulation in the economy. We kind of changed the strategy of the Republicans from taxes are fine to they're too high, we got to do something about it. Nixon was also able to appeal to Southern whites who didn't like what they'd seen in the Johnson administration, didn't like what they were seeing with the anti-war movement, and so on. And Reagan was able to get evangelicals to vote Republican because evangelicals felt abandoned by the Democratic Party. And the party began supporting affirmative action, abortion rights, women's liberation movement. They stopped feeling like Democrats were actually appealing to them. Reagan brought them into the Republican Party. He was also able to bring in working class whites by talking about taxes, the state of the economy, and so on. Ironically, in the 1960s, minority voters went from being fairly solidly Republican to fairly solidly Democrat. It was because of President Johnson and his work on the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that minorities became Democrats instead. So this is where we saw the map really kind of flipping. Democrats have also been considered the party of unions. FDR was a strong proponent of labor laws and unions, so they brought in unions in the 1930s. And they'll try to appeal to Americans concerned on issues like abortion, LGBT rights, women's rights, the environment, minimum wage, and so on. So we've seen the parties kind of switching strategies, switching bases of support. And it does make a difference what state someone is representing. A Democrat in Georgia is probably going to be a little bit more conservative. A Republican in Massachusetts is going to be a little bit more liberal. When the state legalized same-sex marriage in 2004, there was actually pretty strong bipartisan support in the state legislature. So Republicans in Massachusetts are going to be a bit more liberal because the state is a little bit more liberal. Whereas Democrats in Georgia may be a little bit more conservative because the state's a little bit more conservative. So they may not fully agree with their party's platform, partly because of where they are located. A Republican in the Boston area is not going to say that they oppose same-sex marriage because they'll never win re-election again. FYI, early voting has started today. If you're ever on the main campus, there is an early voting station there, as well as the nursing campus. Yeah, I think it's the nursing campus and the main campus have early polling stations. They're open from now until about the beginning of November. So if you want to vote now, you can vote anywhere in the county. Okay, so parties do undergo periodic realignments. What we see as Democrat and Republican parties today look nothing like their original structure. And sometimes it's what's called an electoral realignment. Sometimes Republicans dominate the presidency, the House, and the Senate. Other times it's the Democrats. We saw a little bit of this in 2018 when Democrats took back control of the House of Representatives. So there was a little bit of a shift there. We've also seen changes during major crises. The newly founded Republican Party was created because of slavery, because of the issues leading up to the Civil War. So Lincoln was the first Republican president, and he was the voice of abolition. Right? He got he joined the anti-slavery movement together to create a brand new party. With FDR and the New Deal, we saw Democrats becoming more pro-union, pro-workers, favoring the creation of policies like Social Security, unemployment benefits, government regulation of the banks and Wall Street. And the last major realignment that we've seen is with the Democrats and civil rights. So when President Johnson did support the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, he outraged a lot of his colleagues from the South. They thought he wouldn't support the civil rights movement in the North because he was from Texas. When he actually came out in support of it, they saw it as a betrayal, and Southern whites left the party. Minorities joined the party, and the map flipped on its head. So North went from solidly Republican to solidly Democrat. The South from solidly Democrat to solidly Republican. This is the last major realignment that we've seen. The parties have very much shifted. They look nothing like they did in the 1950s. The Republican Party used to be the party of Social Security, immigration, and so on. We do see issues sometimes with a divided government where the presidency is controlled by one party, Congress by another. We do have a divided government right now because Republicans control the White House and the Senate. Democrats control the House of Representatives. This could happen in November. President Trump could win re-election, but Democrats could take control of the House and the Senate. That would be a divided government. And that happens when the people are frustrated, especially with Congress. If they're like, Congress isn't doing their job, we're going to switch, give the other party a chance. That's when we see a divided government. Realignments tend to occur when there's an economic or social problem that weakens the party in power. So when the economy collapsed in 2008, voters punished the Republican Party by electing Democrats across the board. So they lost power because of the economic climate. Whether or not that will happen in November because of COVID is still up in the air. But usually, the party in charge, if something happens on their watch, like a pandemic, a collapse of the economy, and so on, they don't usually tend to stay in power. Now, both parties are factions. They're never united on everything. We're not all sitting around, singing Kumbaya. Within the Democratic Party, the fractioning is between moderates and progressives. Moderate Democrats tend to focus more on the economic issues rather than the social issues. They're concerned with the minimum wage, the state of the economy, taxes. So their focus is more on the economic side rather than the social issues. So Nancy Pelosi and Tom Perez, who's the head of the Democratic National Committee, are more moderate. They're not as likely to support some of the more progressive legislation coming out of Congress. They're more focused on trying to win back voters in 2016 who are concerned with the economy, trying to get white working class voters to vote Democrat this time around. And then you have, of course, progressive Democrats who are to the left of the party, generally speaking. And they are concerned with issues like poverty, universal health care, student loan debt, and the environment. The Green New Deal, trying to promote alternative energies, comes from a more progressive wing. And so the leaders of the progressive movement include Bernie Sanders in the Senate and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the House of Representatives. They've been fighting with the leadership to get more progressive legislation on the floor. Nancy Pelosi isn't enthusiastic about the Green New Deal. She doesn't like the potential economic costs it could have. So right now there's a fight over, do we stay in the middle or do we move a little bit more to the left? I saw this playing out in the 2020 election. There were a lot of candidates running, and it looked for a while like Bernie Sanders was going to get the nomination, which wasn't exactly what the party wanted. So some of the more moderate candidates like Pete Buttigieg were encouraged to drop out to get a race between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, and Joe Biden won. But there are questions about, is this the right strategy? Does staying in the middle actually help Democrats? They tried it in 2016. It wasn't very successful. If they don't win this year, I think there's going to be even more fighting in the party because the progressives would be able to say, you guys stayed in the middle and it didn't work, so you got to start listening to us. So there is some fighting between the two sides, and it's not clear who's going to win, but it is a little problematic. You think they would have learned in 2016, okay, young people supported Bernie, who's more of a progressive. How do we get young people to vote? Maybe we adopt some of the progressive ideas, but they don't quite seem to have learned that yet. On the Republican side, we're seeing a bit of an issue between moderate and conservative Republicans. Moderate Republicans tend to split on economic and social issues. They tend to be more economically conservative and socially conservative. So some of the key moderate Republicans include John Kasich, who's the governor of Ohio, and Charlie Baker, who's the governor of Massachusetts. They're not as strict on issues like abortion and LGBT rights compared to other members of their party. Now, for Charlie Baker, again, being governor of Massachusetts, by nature, you're just not going to be as conservative as other members of your party, because Massachusetts, because of Boston, tends to be a little bit more liberal. So you don't want to anger more moderate voters in your state. Another faction we see is the Tea Party slash pretty conservative Republicans. They merged in the 2010 election, and they are both economically and socially conservative. It started out as just kind of a protest movement against the Republicans in Congress supporting the stimulus package because of the economic collapse. And then they started running candidates, and they started winning, and they became an actual threat within the party. So some Republicans who identify as Tea Party-ish include former Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, and our current Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. Although in all likelihood, I think Dan Patrick's going to have a challenger in the primaries in 2022. It didn't help when he said that older Americans are willing to die to keep the economy open. Not exactly the right thing to be saying there. So the party is fighting over ideological differences. Do you have to be conservative to be a Republican? That's the question they're facing. Moderate Republicans are being accused of being rhinos, which is a Republican in name only. But their response to that is, if we move to the right, then we lose the people who are in the middle. And then you've got people like Ted Cruz who say you're not actually a Republican unless you're truly conservative. So they're going back and forth on that as well. We are seeing some issues with President Trump. There are Republicans who don't particularly care for him, so there's going to be a little bit more of a fractioning between Trump Republicans and non-Trump Republicans. For example, John Kasich refused to endorse Donald Trump at all during the 2016 election cycle. So they're also facing some pretty big infighting that's not going to be easily fixed, especially if they don't win in November. One way or the other, this election is going to have an impact on the parties. It's just a matter of which party is going to have more of the fighting. It also doesn't help that the parties have become increasingly polarized. Democrats have become more liberal, Republicans have become more conservative. And part of this is because the elections are not competitive. We've only got about 24 out of 435 House races being considered competitive. You don't have to compromise. You don't have to be a moderate. You can be an ultra-liberal who knows that you're going to win your district no matter what. There's not a lot of incentive to compromise, to be more moderate. Even though the majority of Americans do hold more moderate views. So Congress isn't reflecting the American people. People are looking at the fact that Mitch McConnell is holding up bills from the House, and they're going, why aren't you guys just doing your damn jobs? We don't pay you to sit there and do it. Members of Congress vote with the party 90% of the time, which again does not help. So Democrats in the House will pass a bill, Senate Republicans will kill it, and vice versa. There's a lot of legislation that's sitting on the desk of Mitch McConnell that he just won't bring to the floor because it's sponsored by the Democratic Party. We see this played out with the Supreme Court. Justice Scalia died in February of 2016. Constitutionally speaking, when there is a vacancy on the Supreme Court, the president has the right to nominate someone and the Senate to confirm. There's no time restrictions. President Obama nominated Merrick Garland, and the Republicans in the Senate said, we're not going to hold confirmation hearings until after the election because the American people should get a say on who's on the court. But this time around, we've got Republicans saying we need to fill the seat before the election, and Democrats saying, if you wouldn't let us do it in 2016, why are you trying to do it now? So the Supreme Court is being held hostage by the parties. Obama should have been able to nominate someone to the court, and President Trump be able to nominate someone to the Senate. It doesn't matter when there's a vacancy. Constitutionally, the president has the authority to nominate someone. It shouldn't be delayed because of party politics. And the confirmation hearing shouldn't be as ugly as they are. We're also seeing the parties using the filibuster more often. And we'll talk more about the filibuster when we talk about Congress, but it's a special power given to the Senate. So the party that's not in control will filibuster to block legislation or to block the president nominating someone for judgeship or whatever. So if they know they don't have the votes, they'll just sit on the floor and filibuster in the hopes that they can kill that particular nomination. The Congress just isn't getting much done because neither party is actually willing to negotiate with the other one. I have to admit, it was kind of funny to watch Republicans try to do backflips and walk back what they said in 2016 when they said the American people should have a say before we fill a Supreme Court vacancy, and try to, walk back what they said. It's just ridiculous. And both sides are acting like idiots. All right, the third parties. We do have a lot of third parties. We have libertarians, Greens, Social Democrats, a Communist Party. But they don't necessarily win. So they're seen as a protest movement against the two major parties. And the Democrat and Republican parties do not like third-party candidates. They see them as spoilers, as taking votes away from their candidates. And there is some validity to this. In 1992, Ross Perot ran as an independent. He was the most successful third-party presidential candidate in history. He got the votes of almost 1 in 5 Americans. He took votes away from President George H.W. Bush, fractured the Republican vote, and gave the presidency to Bill Clinton. In 2000, Ralph Nader won 3% of the popular vote. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it was enough to essentially give the election to George W. Bush. Of course, the 2000 election was also problematic in a lot of other ways, but the two parties don't like third-party candidates. In 2004, Democrats were pressuring Ralph Nader not to run again because they didn't want him taking votes from John Kerry. On the one hand, you can understand that. On the other hand, you don't get to tell someone they can't run for president, right? He has party's nomination, get over it. And Ralph Nader ran as a Green Party candidate, by the way. And it's hard for third-party candidates to get on the ballot anywhere. They have to get more than 5% of the national presidential vote to get federal funding. It's also very hard for them to get on the stage in a debate. Gus Perot was on the stage with President George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton in '92, but only because he was a billionaire who could afford to spend enough money to be polling well enough to get on the stage. Otherwise, it's just the two-party candidates, right? It's always just Trump Clinton, Trump Biden, Obama McCain. It's never the third-party candidates on that stage. There are some independents. Bernie Sanders is an independent in the Senate because he's a Democrat, but he's not a Democrat kind of. They're few and far between. They have a hard time with registration fees, requirements to get on the ballot, and so on. So they exist, they're just not seen as contenders. They're not seen as candidates who could actually have a chance of winning. And that's problematic as well because sometimes you might like a third-party candidate. You might like Ralph Nader or Joe Jorgensen, who's running for Libertarians. Even if you like them, you understand that they can't win. Then you make yourself choose the lesser of two evils. Well, I liked Gary Johnson or Jill Stein in 2016, but they're not going to win, so I guess I'll vote for Trump as the lesser of two evils. Or I guess I'll vote for Clinton even though I don't really. So people may like third-party candidates, but they know because of the way the system is set up, they can't win. So either they vote as a protest or they pick which one of the two parties they can actually tolerate. One of the ways we could fix this broken two-party system is to switch to using what's called a ranked choice voting. This is used throughout much of Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa and South America. And basically, here's how it works. You're given a list of candidates and you rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? So let's say for president, your first choice is Jill Stein. Your second choice is Joe Biden. Your third choice is Gary Johnson, and so on. You vote based on preference for whoever is running. If a candidate gets basically 51%, which is a simple majority, they win. If, however, no candidate gets the majority, there's a runoff election between the top 2 or top 3 vote getters. We tend to see more cooperation between the candidates, because if you can't be someone's first choice, you want to be their second choice, right? You could make it to that runoff. They are not going to call your opponent a liar, sleazebag, donkey, whatever, right? You're going to be more cooperative. It's not going to be as ugly, because you're not going to get votes if you are ugly towards your opponent. It gives the voters more of a say. Candidates are elected by the majority. You get to pick the person you think is the best candidate regardless of party. It does allow for a multi-party system. It's why you can see in Parliament in the UK, the Labour Party, the Tories, the Greens, and a couple of other parties actually being able to participate. It fixes the problem of a two-party system in some ways. It would make the candidates have to be a bit more cooperative. We have it in a couple of places, Maine, San Francisco, Oakland, Minneapolis, and Cambridge, but we don't use it everywhere. It would be useful because we'd actually have the candidate elected by the majority, not the plurality. So it would fix some of the problems with our system. It's not going to fix everything, but it would solve some of the problems that we see. Also in these systems, if no party gets a majority in Parliament, then they have to form a coalition with another party. There's more cooperation between the parties as well. Right. So the reality is that our party system just doesn't function very well. We need to have competition. The more competitive the election, the more likely people are to vote. If your House seat has a 50-50 chance, you would show up to vote, right? If you think your candidate can't win without your vote, then you are going to show up. If, on the other hand, you know your candidate's guaranteed to win or guaranteed to lose, you're not going to show up. We need more competition. We need to make it harder for someone to inevitably win every single election. We don't get high voter turnout in the U.S., partly because of things like the Electoral College, but also, again, competitiveness. If you're a Republican in Chicago, you're not going to vote. There's no point because the Democrats will win. If you're a Democrat in Alabama, outside of certain cities, you're probably not going to vote because your candidate's not going to win. Without proper competition, the voters don't feel any incentive to vote. Why bother? My vote's not going to make a difference. The upside is that the parties are no longer controlled by this small elite group in Washington, D.C. Because of primaries and caucuses, parties get their power from the local, the state, and the national level. We get to pick the presidential candidates. We get to pick who runs for Senate and House and governor. So they don't have as much control over who gets to run and when, right? We get a say in that. We get to say this person could be our party's nominee. We are seeing more online fundraising. It does get people involved. If a candidate says donate $10 and you'll be entered into a raffle, okay. It does increase differences in opinions. You'll have progressive Democrats saying, why isn't Biden talking more about healthcare? Moderate Democrats saying, well, why should he? It's, this isn't something he can really play around with in this election. Or moderate Republicans saying, why are you guys talking about building a border wall, and conservative Republicans saying, why aren't you bored with this? The parties are facing a fair number of problems. And the two-party system is, in my opinion, we're reaching the point where there's going to need to be a realignment, possibly major fracturing in both parties. It just isn't sustainable at this point. And I think there's so much infighting that this could be the election that changes the parties and shakes things up again. Especially for Republicans, because if Trump loses, then you're going to have the Republicans who were supporting Trump being criticized by the Republicans who weren't, and then people fighting over, well, which way should the party go? Should we move more back towards the middle? Should we stay conservative? Democrats, if Biden loses, the progressives might be able to say, hey, you guys ran another moderate candidate, it didn't work, you got to start paying attention to us. It's not going to be pretty for the parties either way. It's going to be a little bit tricky. All right, so how many of you think our current two-party system actually works? No. Yeah. How many of you would vote for a third-party candidate if they actually had a chance to win? Yeah, if they, yeah, yeah. It would be nice if, let's say, in the Senate, we had like, I don't know, 40 Democrats, 40 Republicans, and 20 from different parties, right? Because then nobody would be in the majority, and they'd actually have to start working with each other. Not the world's worst idea. I did read an article recently in Foreign Policy magazine that suggests that we may actually see the two parties fracturing into four parties in the near future. We may get the moderate Democratic Party and the progressive Democrats. We might get Republicans, and then we might get a conservative party. They might actually fracture into four smaller parties instead of two, which would have a major impact on the elections, of course, because if you have four candidates running instead of two, then it gets a little bit more complicated. Then it does open the door for third-party candidates at that point. I don't know if that's going to happen, but it's possible. I mean, we may be reaching the point where the two-party system just isn't viable anymore. So that could be interesting. Okay. Any questions, thoughts? Okay. As a reminder, your research paper is due November 10th, so that's coming up. If you want me to take a look at a draft of your research paper, I can do that. If you still haven't turned in your midterm yet, make sure I get it ASAP, because I have graded the ones that have been submitted. We're going to start talking about elections on Thursday, so read the first half of chapter 10. If you have any questions, you can always email me or call or text me. So I'll see you guys online on Thursday. And if you weren't here at the beginning for attendance, come see me.